Today's video is brought to you by our sponsors over at Raycon, disrupting the electronics industry by making great sound for everyone, releasing their earbuds at half the starting price. Raycon earbuds give you 6 hours of playtime, seamless Bluetooth pairing, really seamless indeed, more bassiness, and a more compact design for an everyday, comfortable, noise-isolating fit. I mean, have you seen the pill box? It comes in really nice and cute. Raycon offers their wireless earbuds in a fun variety of colors and patterns, and even a bunch of fit options for everyone with different ears, right? But the best part is no dangling wires or stems. God bless on that one. The company was co-founded by Ray J, and celebrities like Snoop Dogg and Mike Tyson are all in. Raycon is a 45-day free return policy, so if you don't like your purchase for whatever reason, then give it back. But that said, I know what I'm doing this summer with Raycons. I'm going to head on down to the beach now that we can go outside and just listen to some good tunes while running down like Sonic the Hedgehog. That said, though, I want to know what you do with your Raycon purchases. So head on over down to buyraycon.com/someordinarygamer and get 15% off your next Raycon purchase. Hello guys and gals, me Mudahar, and boy oh boy, Windows 11, I'm making the perfect ultimate gaming virtual machine. Now why Windows 11? Well, because I actually enjoy Windows 11, believe it or not, and no, I don't have a gun pointed to my head, and if you look closely, I do not have a sniper rifle trained to my forehead right now. So I'm going to be just fine, I'm going to be okay. If anything, I hope the G Fuel will protect me behind. But why Windows 11? Well, in the last several days that I've been using it, it's actually been running a lot smoother than I expected. The system itself is more stable than Windows 10, and Windows 10 is already pretty goddamn stable. The update process is pretty smooth, pretty, hassle-free, boot loop-free so far. And the other reality is that the gaming has actually been a far better experience, which is kind of a bit odd to me. I've been noticing that my frame rates on average have been a lot higher. Well, not a lot. It depends on the game. But usually when I play games like Cyberpunk 2077, I'm noticing that I'm getting like 6-7 frames higher than I usually would, which may not sound like a lot, but if you're looking at an operating system to an operating system, that's still an improvement, and it's a pretty impressive improvement. Games like Red Dead Redemption have now been consistently running above 100 frames per second for me on the absolute maximum settings, at a time where I used to be playing that game at like 80, 85 FPS. A little bit odd. And then games like Rainbow Six Siege have never skipped a beat for me. Even though they ran really smooth on Windows 10, in some way, beyond placebo, the games have been running smoother for me on Windows 11. Now, why is that? Windows 11, last time we looked at it, I said it was basically Windows 10 with a fresh coat of paint. In fact, most tech YouTubers effectively said the exact same thing. Now, back when I covered it, I was the first person, by the way, to use a Windows 11 gaming virtual machine. And I played games like Yakuza Like a Dragon, and it ran really well. I was actually blown away throughout my last few days utilizing Windows 11, editing videos on it, about how smooth and how... Now, in this setup Linus showed, he used a software called Unraid, which is a product that you can purchase that effectively is the same thing that we have been doing, just a bit more easier to pull off with it. It has its own, graphic user interface. It's basically based off of Linux. Unraid is just Linux, and they utilize Linux to run their Windows virtual machines and pass graphic cards through. So Unraid isn't some cheap solution. Obviously it's very great if you just want to get these things up and running pretty quickly. But I don't recall if Linus actually went into this and really went and optimize this virtual machine for the best performance. So things like CPU pinning, huge pages, a lot of these minor optimizations that end up leading to pretty tangible benefits and experiences is something that we're going to do today to make this virtual machine experience even more perfect than it already is. So why is it that Windows 11, a developer version, is suddenly doing a lot better than expected? Now, to understand, this is a developer version of an operating system, meaning that whatever we've seen so far is not subject to show up in the final build at all. As par for the course for development, a lot of stuff that gets introduced can very easily be removed simply because it just doesn't work well in a final product. These things go through a lot of careful quality control checks. What you and I may think works absolutely flawlessly may break down badly in some other, control test that Microsoft has done. Now, Microsoft is going to reveal all of Windows 11 in like 2 days, which is fucking insane considering the fact that Windows 10 was supposed to be the last goddamn Windows. Now they're making 11, so whatever. Now, because of this increase in performance that I noticed, I decided, okay, why not make the ultimate gaming virtual machine? Because I feel like I have to update my VM videos a fair bit. Now, why? That's because we need to optimize these virtual machines so that they're almost impeccable for gaming, so that nobody can come in between us and say, Muda, that's a dumb way to game. Now, I've been asked a lot of questions about Mudahar. You play virtual machine games. Do you suffer lag? The reality is I never lag with virtual machines. Why? That's because it's not VMware. People have this misconception that the virtual machine I use is like VirtualBox and VMware or anything of that nature. Those are Type 2 hypervisors with no graphic card pass-through. The way that I game is basically creating a virtual machine for Windows, passing a graphic card to it. So to the naked eye, it basically looks like you were using Windows 10 installed natively, but you're not. It's a virtual machine. So the way that we're going to achieve this is basically creating the ultimate VM by using Linux, all right? Now, in this case, I'm going to use something called Ubuntu. Now, the reason I'm mentioning Ubuntu in this case, even though I've mentioned things like Manjaro in the past, or Fedora, or Debian, is that Ubuntu is, number one, very popular. I think it's one of the most popular distributions just out there by market share. Two, there's a lot of support for it. And three, even the stuff that I show you on Arch, like the Arch Wiki, can be used to alleviate and troubleshoot a lot of Ubuntu's problems for as well. This is just something that's going to work, okay? It's a very popular distribution, and there's no shame in using Ubuntu, whether you're a first-time Linux, you're trying it out, or you're a professional. This is a fine operating system. I know that I might be throwing hands with the community, and frankly, I don't fucking care, okay? If you want to use something else, go for it. But I'm going to assume from now on, every time that I do these virtual machine guides, it's just going to be Ubuntu. And I want you to treat it like that too. I'm only doing this so I can save the headache for a lot of people and myself going forward making these videos. Now, once you get something like Ubuntu, the general idea is to isolate and hijack your graphic card. Now, step number one in creating these virtual machines for gaming is to have your graphic card hijacked, all right? So under Linux, what you want to do is make sure the graphic card can be used in a virtual machine. So the general idea is you can approach this in two ways. If you have multiple graphic cards, you can actually hijack one, meaning Linux can never use it, and then pass that through to a virtual machine every time it's fired up. And this method is one that I've shown you time and time already. So the general idea is you install Linux, and then you go into your boot parameters, you make sure Intel IOMMU or AMD IOMMU is enabled, depending on your processor. Once that's enabled, you then run a script to make sure you can check if the IOMMU grouping is only exclusive to that one card. You want to make sure the graphic cards are in their own groups. It's okay if there's more than one or two groups. The reality is, as long as they're all in their groups without nothing else intervening, you're fine. Otherwise, you have to go into things like ACS patching, which isn't the biggest headache in the world, but you want to make sure that everything is isolated. Once you've seen that, it's time to get the hardware IDs. Once you have them jotted down, you can pass them through as the system is booting up in your parameters, and then it will hijack those graphic cards as the system is fired up. Then you can create your virtual machine, pass them through, and bam, you're done. Now, if you have only one graphic card in your system, so for instance, I only have one NVIDIA card because this thing is a gas guzzler, this RTX series, and at that point, all you have to do really is approach it roughly the same way. The idea is that you want to be able to detach the graphic card from Linux and pass it over to your virtual machine as you fire it up. And then when you turn off your virtual machine, have that graphic card detached and reattached to Linux on the hypervisor. And I also have a video for that, but the idea is you get a few scripts, you make sure hooks are enabled for your virtual machine software, which you're going to need regardless if you're doing this. And once you have your hooks enabled, you can then run a script, make sure it's executable, and then eventually have that pass through. Now, you're going to have to store these hooks in a very specific manner, something in your etc, libvirtd, hooks, QEMU folder, and then like release or prepare and all that stuff. I mean, I've mentioned it in that single GPU pass-through video, which I will link, and it'll explain all of it. But you're going to have your hook set up, put your actual GPU script in there, modify it a little bit depending on your graphic card and your computer, and then hopefully, if everything works right, you should be able to switch between operating systems, virtualized or not, and have your graphic card go back and forth. But I have a couple of videos that you can click on and watch to your heart's content to basically achieve this. And this guide is going to assume that you have a working virtual machine with a graphic card passed through. Because if you don't, you might want to start from there and then move on to here. Now, utilizing Windows 11, the installation is generally the same, okay? You go onto KVM, VFIO, you go onto libvirt, and you basically create a virtual machine as you would. You know, you give it like 8 gigs of RAM or however much you want to spare, 4 CPU cores just for the installation process, or again, however much you want. We'll cover this in a bit. And then you want to have your Windows 11 leaked ISO or real ISO if you have it somewhere. And at that point, you're pretty good. Now, if you have a portable SSD, I ended up buying one off Amazon. I plugged it into the system and I passed the entire SSD. Very easy to do. All you have to do is just point it to where the hardware point is on Linux, like dev/SDD in my case, and you'll pass the drive over. Now, at this point, installing Windows 11 is about as easy as, you know, fucking walking your grandma across the street. You hit next a bunch of times, you make sure it installs to the only hard drive the virtual machine can point to, and lo and behold, you're done. Now, at this point, you can pass a graphic card over through, and that's what I did, and eventually I had Windows 11 loaded up as you would natively expect it. Full graphic card updated, a few games downloaded, and here is where the magic begins. Now, at this point, if you remember back when we broke the Valorant anti-cheat situation, which is patched within a week, unfortunately, I added a few parameters to the entire VFIO XML file. Now, this is where things get a bit interesting, okay? To run games like Cyberpunk underneath a virtual machine will involve a bit of a headache. See, if you just install it like this and pass a graphic card over, games like Cyberpunk have been running on the system, at least mine, under a virtual machine at like 40 frames per second. 35! What the fuck? That couldn't be right. Why is the game running that laggy on pretty strong hardware? Well, that's because we've entered a situation where certain games are really CPU heavy. And while Windows 11 has some performance improvements even in this scenario, it's time to kick it up a little bit. Now, from what I've understood, Windows 11 is a bit more friendly to virtualization, at least from what it appears to be in this leaked development version. So, to achieve this, if you look back at the video I made regarding beating Valorant's shitty anti-cheat, which unfortunately was patched a week after that video was posted, I basically added a few lines to my virtual machine XML file, alright? A couple lines that would allow me to gain access to Hyper-V. While these lines aren't important, I added them and generally experience better performance for the most part. However, what was really important here was optimizing the virtual machine to use the hardware more efficiently. Now, if you haven't figured it out, 35 frames per second on a fucking low average is definitely not good for the system I have, and there's no fucking reason, virtual machine or not, that Cyberpunk should be shitting its collective britches. See, the reason why that's happening is because Cyberpunk is a very CPU intensive game, okay? Incredibly CPU intensive. Even with the performance enhancements and the 5 frames extra I'm getting on Windows 11, there's no fucking reason why it should be running this slow. And this is where we're going to be updating our virtual machine so that we can take advantage of things like CPU pinning, which is an incredibly important thing to have. So CPU pinning in general is basically isolating a CPU and keeping it reserved for a virtual machine. So imagine how we kept our graphic card isolated when it launched. We can kind of do that with CPUs by basically ensuring that like 4 cores out of an 8-core system in this case could completely be reserved. That means Linux cannot touch this core set, but only it is just passed through entirely to the operating system. This means that those 4 cores that are passed to the operating system are uninterrupted by Linux. So if you don't do CPU pinning, I want you to imagine a scenario like this. Since you're using Linux as your primary operating system, the moment you fire up a virtual machine, Linux doesn't shut down. It's still doing what it needs to do. Now, under normal conditions, Linux is very good with its scheduler, but when you're playing high-performance games, like open-world titles in this case, or, well, anything that's graphically and CPU demanding, you're going to run into issues where Windows as a virtual machine is going to be fighting for those CPU resources with Linux. Imagine when you're playing a game, Windows will tell Linux, alright, in a very abstract way, I need the CPU space, to which Linux will say, I'm processing something, and since I'm the host, I'm going to be the one using the space instead. So why we're CPU pinning in this case is so that we can give Windows all of its space that it needs and give Linux its 1 or 2 cores to process what it needs. So when Linux is doing something, its processes will not interrupt with Windows and vice versa. Now, there's plenty of ways to achieve this, but in order to do this, we have to understand how your processor works. So underneath Linux, if you have a terminal, you can basically fire up a map, if you will, of your actual CPU. And just to go over this map real quick, what's most important in this is looking at these 8 squares. These squares are all individual cores that are present on the CPU. Now, imagine if you have something like a Threadripper. You'll see way more than these 8 squares, but this is an i9-9900K. It has 8 real cores, but then 8 logical cores. So for every core, there's 2 threads on each core. So if you can look over here, for instance, now, in this first square, you should see P number 0 and P number 8. That's because of hyperthreading, basically where a physical core has a logical core attached to it. If you turned off hyperthreading, it would only show you 8 threads, or, just one box would have just one of these PU boxes in it. Now, this is a terminal shell, which shows you that I have 15 CPUs. Now, it's really 16, 0 is counted as a number as well, but what's more important is this core count. So as you can see, CPU 0 is tied to core 0. But then if you scroll all the way down, you can see that CPU 8 is tied to core 0 as well. And if you look at it, 1 is tied to core 1, but then 9 is tied to core 1. That's because 1 and 9 in this case are utilizing and basically on the same core. So 1 is the physical core, and 9 would be the hyper-threaded logical core. So when you're passing through and pinning, you want to make sure if you're passing, say, core 0, you want to pass through CPU 0 and CPU 8 respectively. Otherwise, you're going to reach a situation where it's not exactly a core being passed through, it's half a core, and that's never okay. Now to do this, we're going to be creating 2 scripts, okay? 2 scripts on top of, if you remember way back when we made the single GPU pass-through, all right? Again, if you haven't done that, you're going to be needing hooks into the system. That's a very important component. That'll make this whole thing a lot easier. So if you don't know that, watch the single GPU pass-through tutorial until I get all the way to like making hooks, right? But generally the idea is we're going to make a hook that'll separate these 2 systems away from each other when they're booted up. And when you turn off the Windows virtual machine, Linux will then use all of the CPUs so that you won't just immediately, kill Linux's entire lifeblood away when you're actually using it. So the way that we're going to be doing is we're going to go to nano, etc, libvirt, okay? Hooks, QEMUD, and as you can see it says Win10, prepare, begin, which you'll need the prepare folder and the begin folder in succession, just because without these, the hooks will not run. But here you can see I have 2 hooks. I have start.sh for the GPU capture, and I have isol start.sh, which is for isolation. So once we hit enter onto this, this is exactly what I've written. Systemctl set property --runtime --user slice allowed CPUs 0 and 8. So why did I give it 0 and 8? Well, that's because 0 and 8 pair together to make that one core that we just saw. Then I do systemctl set property runtime system slice allowed CPU 0, 8, and then systemctl property runtime in its scope allowed CPU 0-8. By entering all of this, when we run our virtual machine now, Linux will only be able to use core 0 and core 8, okay? Or thread 0 and thread 8 in this case, which leaves the rest of the 14 threads on this process. So to demonstrate what actually changed this time, this is BPY-Top, which is actually giving you a full hardware, showcase of what's going on the full system, including Linux and Windows. The task manager is just what Windows sees. So as you can see, it has 1 socket, 7 cores. It doesn't know 2 cores exist. Now, if you look at this system monitor, you can see that core 1 and core 9 are actually running at around like 5%, but then core 2, 3, 4, 5 are at like 35, 26%. That's because while Linux is doing its own thing, Windows is doing its own, and they're not impeding. Right now I'm updating the actual operating system, and it's spiked core 1 to like 13, 20%. So Linux got to do a full system update, and Windows did not care. So you could have been playing a game and suffered no CPU impact because of this. So now if you look at Cyberpunk, our frame rate jumped all the way from like a 40 average to like 70 because Cyberpunk is not trying to fight. Windows is not trying to fight while trying to process this game. Just CPU pinning alone is able to give these massive increases. And yeah, it's not bare metal. Bare metal would be like 2-3 frames on average faster than what we get over here. But at this point, it's pretty inconsequential when you look at the benefits of making sure Windows can't spy beyond its own bullshit scope anyways. So once you're done all of that, what happens when you want to just, quit this entire bullshit? Well, you go to Nano, Etsy, Libvirt, Hooks, QEMUD, Win10, all right, whatever your name of the virtual machine is, release, all right, end, and then you want to go to isol cpu revert.sh. This is a script that was written in, and this script will say, hey, systemctl set property runtime user slice allowed CPU 0-15. All right, and why 0-15? Because now Linux can use every thread once a virtual machine is not running. It's a simple use of systemctl's property is already part of it, which exist all across Ubuntu, Arch, Manjaro, whatever modern versions of Linux that you have. So, what did this all do for us? Well, it allowed us to actually gain massive performance increases underneath a virtual machine. Now, I have done these exact same modifications to Windows 10 virtual machines and Windows 11 virtual machines, and I've generally experienced a better use case on Windows 11. For instance, games like Cyberpunk, as we just said, reach 70 frames per second. Mind-boggling to know that big of a performance increase could actually fucking happen. Then we ended up looking at Red Dead Redemption 2, and Red Dead Redemption 2 was almost hitting 110 frames per second for a little bit. So again, mind-boggling that this was happening. Now, the other massive thing that this fixed up was a lot of stuttering. If you don't do this, a lot of games will stutter pretty fucking hard, okay? For some reason, if you don't CPU pin, not massive games, all right, your average games like Halo Master Chief Collection will run relatively well, but games like Cyberpunk, Red Dead, or even Monster Hunter World in my case, were having issues with input and stuttering because of them running underneath a virtual machine. Optimizing it this way made it a lot easier for people to use. Some optimizations that I feel like should be mentioned is, for instance, if you have any gaming mouse, I have a Logitech G600, you got to make sure that these polling rates are actually down to like 125. I find that 250 is a sweet spot, and the reason I'm saying this is in certain games, not every title, you'll often find an issue where like moving the mouse will drop 50 frames in a virtual machine. I've had this with Call of Duty Warzone. I found that turning the polling rate to absolutely minimal has absolutely resulted in no frame loss. So for some reason, this is an issue. I feel like I should mention it because I have it. And so if somebody gets this exact same issue, they can try this without ripping their hair out. Now, we can do a similar performance enhancement in terms of RAM as well by creating something called huge pages, and you'll find a great repository for this in the Arch Wiki, but the idea behind this is basically at boot time, we're going to say reserve, in my case, 32 gigabytes of RAM, untouched by Linux or anything. And this is dependent on how much RAM you have in your system. If you have something like 16 gigs, maybe it's not so practical to split your RAM between two operating systems. Who wants to use an 8 gig system at this point? There are performance improvements in a lot of areas. Sometimes they may be tangible, sometimes they may not be tangible enough, so really it's something you're going to have to test the waters with as you go forward. There is ways to actually do this by splitting the RAM up as you fire up a virtual machine and have the cake and eat it too, but I haven't found a completely reliable method, so I'm kind of going to skip over this, but I felt like I had to mention huge pages because they do offer a benefit. However, how much that benefit goes as far is dependent on what your use case is. So anyways, let's move forward. What even baffles my mind is using software like Cinebench to rate my system. I was actually getting better performance on this system, all right, virtualized, way better than I was expecting. Normally, when you virtualize a system, you expect to lose like 5% of your system's overall power. But with Windows 11, the margins got so razor thin that at this point, it doesn't matter if you're using a virtual machine or you're actually using a bare metal system anyways. The speed is basically the same anyways. My i9 9900K underneath all these optimizations and Windows 11's optimizations was running so smoothly that I actually think Windows 11 is going to be a banger, at least for me, a virtual machine user in the near future, because whatever Microsoft has done under the hood with Windows 11 is still yet to be determined and yet to come out. But what I've seen so far, I fucking like. And with what I liked, I ended up making a pretty solid epic virtual machine. And because of that, I'm going to go sit back and play Cyberpunk and Red Dead Redemption 2 with the frame rates that I should have been expecting with this system. And as the light bulb goes off, this video is coming to its close. And ladies and gentlemen, I really should get that fucking fixed. But at the end of the day, congratulations, we have reached a new level of virtual machine gaming, one that I expect to be one-upped in the near future when it comes down to dividing this RTX 3090 across maybe 4 virtual machines, but that'll be a separate video for a different time. For now, we just made the ultimate Windows 11 gaming virtual machine. And for what it's worth, it was an absolutely fun experiment, and I'm glad I got to do it before the official announcement of Windows 11. So yeah, we made a Windows 11 gaming virtual machine pretty much matched up to near native levels before the system was even announced. God bless. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it. I am out.